Goes. All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenience, truth-telling, and myth-busting. As always, very happy with the guest I have on. So we are rejoined by Chris Williamson. Chris was the former MP for Derby North for the Labour Party and then Independent. And while it saddens me, he's no longer one of the few voices of reason in the British Parliament. He has since become a fine independent journalist and a tireless social justice and anti-imperialist activist in the UK. He is the host and co-host of Resistance TV, now Resist, which people can find on YouTube. And as part of an organization he founded, Resist Movement for a People's Party, which is a superb advocacy organization. And I fully endorse the program they advocate and hope they go far. It's our All Things UK England edition, which I haven't done in a while. So who better than to have on Chris back on to discuss how Britain is doing. We'll be talking about the ongoing coronavirus crisis, if time, the plight of political prisoner and prisoner of conscience Julian Assange, the awful identity politics versus class struggle of the bits, and if time, the movement to form a new, truly left-wing political party that can become a true force for good and have a big impact in Great Britain. So first of all, Chris, welcome back to the program. It's been way too long.
Good to be here, mate. Yeah, good to be here.
It's it's an honor to have you back on. And just before I get to my questions, I just want to say solidarity to Imran Khan and the people of Pakistan. Pakistan's been the latest country that's a victim of the Anglo-American empire and their Gulf allies. And we talk about abolishing the police, defunding the police. I really do think that the CIA, the military, the deep state, MI6, GCHQ, all of those dodgy secret services and their military should also be abolished along with the police, and demilitarized, defunded, and disbanded. So solidarity to the people of Pakistan and Imran Khan, who was saying to the powers to be, I am not going with you guys on this anti-Russia, anti-China collision course. And then, of course, solidarity to Julian Assange, and of course, solidarity to our left-leaning friends at RT Sputnik, Redfish, and all those Russian-affiliated state media who are all being censored, and of course, solidarity to the indigenous people fighting for their land back. So once again, Chris, thank you for coming back on the program. And so, Chris, my first question I want to ask you is, I'd like to ask you, a question regarding the ongoing coronavirus crisis. And despite what COVID minimalists and denialists and others putting their, head in the sand, would have us believe that we are still, we're still living in a world ravaged by this pandemic. We are barely out of the woods and river and vanquishing the virus and getting into a COVID-free world. So my first question is, when the pandemic first broke out, what were you and like-minded comrades on the left in Britain advocating, the government and devolved parliaments do in response to the outbreak? What do you and like-minded folks still believe should be the response to the ongoing coronavirus crisis?
Well, I guess we've got to learn to live with COVID. I don't think there's any way in which we can eliminate it. The evidence seems to be pointing in that direction. And I think as well, we need to be mindful of the role of Big Pharma. This has certainly been used as a money spinning operation around the world. And obviously it's in their interests, I think, to sow fear about a virus. I mean, that's not to minimize the impact of it. I think the government's response didn't go anywhere near far enough in the first instance. Many people whose livelihoods were affected by the virus, small businesses and so on. I mean, there was some modest support available for some, but not everybody qualified, and the support that was available was inadequate. And so many of the people's jobs and businesses and so on have never recovered. And I think in a country like Britain, with the size of its economy, there is a lot more that it could have done. And of course, it's also important, I think, to acknowledge that, as I've already mentioned, Big Pharma, but other very wealthy elites did very well out of the period of lockdown and so on, and substantially increased their their wealth. And so, I think going forward, as I've said, we need to look at or recognise it's a question of kind of living with the virus, and I think we need to be slightly sceptical about the role of Big Pharma and this kind of never-ending round of vaccines that they sort of are advocating. Clearly, there are some groups in society which are more vulnerable than others, and I think that's where the focus should be concentrated.
That's a perfect segue then to my to my second question, which is what has been we're going to get into the whole big pharma issue and vaccines later, but before we get into that, what has been the ruling Tory government's response and the opposition Labour Party and Lib Dems response to the response if there has been
well
any?
They've been virtually indistinguishable. I mean, the political class in this country has totally failed the country, it seems to me, and there is hardly a cigarette paper between all of them on this issue, and indeed on many other issues for that matter. And so I don't think we've been well served by the political class in Britain. There's been no opposition. The government seemed to me to be serving the interests of wealthy elites in the country, as you would expect from the Conservative Party, and have left everybody else in the lurch, really. And so that's one of the reasons why we are trying to build an alternative. We will take time, of course, because the mainstream media, corporate media, is in the pockets of the big corporations and so on, and so they act as their mouthpiece. And so it's difficult to obviously build that alternative, but we are doing what we can, and we are making some headway, but there is a long way to go, of course.
And that's a perfect segue then to that's a perfect segue into this question, because you already opened Pandora's box about many people would disagree with you about living with the virus. Other people say that we need to vanquish the virus, and other people say, Chris, you're peddling in anti-vax conspiracy theories and stuff like that. So following up with what you were saying, given I'm sure England was no stranger to the anti-vax fundamentalist movement that has gripped much of Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand, who are an extent, and some of them are an extension of the ridiculous anti-masker folks and the anti-lockdown folks. There are even some left-leaning anti-war folk who subscribe to some of that and the COVID, minimalist denialist view. Some who think that the vaccines aren't 80 to 100% safe. Now, let's say that the vaccines aren't 100% safe, and we'd like to win over those folks who are vaccine hesitant and others who don't trust the vaccine because they say it was too quickly made, lots of corners cut, there's been conflicts of interest, etc. Then don't we need to go back to lockdowns for 6 to 7 months, like when the pandemic first broke out? That could very well vanquish the spread of infections, but also give producers more time to make something, hopefully, that settles, make something that settles the concerns of those who are anti-vax. And while people are under lockdowns, we advocate and push hard that a UBI is given to people, businesses are compensated for inconveniences, and we just don't let businesses go under. We suspend people's rents, mortgages, and taxes. Schools might be more difficult, but we can put a pause on schools and either delay everyone or compensate schools for time off that folks will go through, and also compensate the staff of school of all ages. What do you, I think what do you say to all
most
of that?
most people in this country have been vaccinated now. I mean, the overwhelming majority of people. So there is a measure of protection now in any event, and people that are, being infected by the coronavirus are, yes, getting relatively mild symptoms. The number of individuals who are experiencing serious effects of coronavirus are very few, I believe the statistics seem to indicate. So I'm not sure that necessarily going back into lockdown is the way forward, if I'm honest. I mean, I think we've got to a point now where, as I've said already, that it's a question of living with the virus as we live with influenza and a range of other infectious diseases, and society manages to function. Where we need, I think, to ensure that we do focus attention is again on the vulnerable cohorts in society. I think if we do that, then hopefully we can provide some measure of protection for people. But I mean, I think that initially a lot of people were thinking that the vaccination regime would stop the spread of the virus. Well, we know now that's not true. Indeed, many people who had been vaccinated still contract the virus. So
but they're not knocking on heavens. But they're not knocking on heaven.
No, absolutely. Yeah, no. I mean, I think the point of the benefits of the the benefits of the vaccine is that if you are infected with it, the symptoms are seemingly, according to what we're told, and the statistics seem to bear this out, that the symptoms are considerably milder than what they were for people who were unvaccinated. And indeed, I think people who have been infected, that will render them with a degree of natural immunity as well. And it's still very early days, and I think there needs to be a lot more research done into the benefits and so on of vaccination and the measure of protection it gives you, alongside the protection which is afforded through natural immunity where people have been infected and so on.
But wasn't herd immunity the thing that the shit that hit the fan, though? Wasn't it that kind of attitude of Boris Johnson and many of the far right to centrist neoliberals who were saying, oh, it's just like the flu, don't worry guys, yeah, a couple of old people are going to die, but everyone else is going to develop herd immunity, and that's what led to the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe some people were dismissive, some people thought there were other agendas at play, and maybe there were other agendas at play, but I think it's important to compare how Britain has fared against other countries who maybe didn't introduce the measures, like Sweden, I think, for example, didn't have as rigorous a response, and just see how the infection rates, mortality rates compare. And I don't think there's any hard evidence that the response that was embraced ultimately in the end in Britain was necessarily the one that afforded the greatest protection for people in terms of illness, never mind the impact on people's livelihoods and so on.
But then a quick follow-up. But that's why I say, if people don't trust the vaccine, and if the vaccine, really doesn't, protect us 100% from coronavirus, and we still get sick, but we're not knocking on heaven's door, and we do have mild COVID, then shouldn't we then go back to 6 to 7 month lockdowns, or however long it takes for a vaccine that the anti-vax folk feel is 100% safe to inject in them? But when we do go to lockdown, we do the following: we give everyone a universal basic income. We suspend people's rents, mortgages, and taxes. If people if people are going to lose their jobs, but that's not going to be the problem, because what we're going to be advocating is that we compensate and we bail out all of those businesses until the anti-vax folk feel like such a safe vaccine is going to be safe. It's always good to have. It's always good to do a new vaccine, which is 100% safe rather than 70 to 80% safe. Shouldn't we on the left, whether in Britain and elsewhere, be advocating for that, since we're still in this pandemic world? And yeah.
Well, I mean, I think, as I say, I think we've moved on from the very serious effects, certainly in the developed world anyway, of COVID. I mean, and no vaccine is 100% safe anyway. I mean, vaccines have been around a long time.
Nothing for Big Pharma is 100% safe, even
dude. They can be. There can be side effects, but I mean, I think there are other issues that we need to be talking about, and that is whether Big Pharma should be in the private sector. I don't think it should be. I think it should be a public sector agenda, and we wouldn't then be looking at these colossal prices that the National Health Service this country, for example, is paying out, and we could be more assured of it being it could be more assured that it would be operating in the interests of public good, not in the interests of private profit.
Yeah, my friends in Canada would definitely agree with you on that. They're part like in Canada, there's a movement called Pharmacare where you either nationalize the big pharmaceutical companies, or you put like a price control to make sure that they're not gouging the prices, and and all of us have to pay out of pocket when we do get cancer or whatever disease. And the left in Canada would also, I know you're for merging mental health care with a newly robust single payer NHS system. My friends in Canada are also advocating for that, and that antidepressants like lithium, Zoloft, medication for schizophrenia, and so forth, that would all be covered in a pharmacare program. So would you advocate? Would you and your comrades be advocating for that in England, so that people can feel a little more, safe about, consuming whatever big pharma says that we need?
Oh, well, certainly, I think we should be looking at that. But I think there's a culture of over medication in any event, and I think there may be other things that can be done, social policies that can be adopted that can remove the feeling of need for medication and so on. And if we had a better society, more equitable society, and focused on the public good, as it were, then I think many of the mental health problems associated with modern living in such an unequal society, I think, could be eliminated. I mean, obviously there will be occasions where medication is necessary, but I think we should seek where we can to avoid its use and look at medical alternatives where possible, and ensure that where we are using those medical interventions, that we know that it's being done, as it were, as I've already said, in the public interest, not in the interests of generating bumper dividends for shareholders.
Yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree with you on that, and that's a subject that we're going to definitely talk about in a much more extended program sometime in the future. And I hope to get to and I would like you to get to get an NHS doctor and a mental health worker from England to actually come on about that discussion about the need to merge mental health care with a new with a renationalized NHS, because the NHS has been basically privatized.
Well, it's on the way. I mean, many of the services provided by the National Health Service are now being provided under the NHS banner, but actually are being provided by private companies now. And obviously there are moves afoot to substantially break up the NHS still further. And so that's why we talk about, the renationalising is the National Health Service. A lot of people are probably not fully aware of the extent of the invasion of private companies into the NHS, because it's done under the, it's sort of badged
because
still
the press doesn't report on it.
Well, not only that. I mean, the press don't do that, but also the services that are being provided by private healthcare organisations, insurance companies, and so on. The actual front-facing facility has an NHS badge on it, so people don't know that it's being provided by the private sector in that sense. So.
Yeah, and open invitation to Dr. Alison Pollack, Dr. Bob Gill, and Dr. Julia Grace Patterson of Every Doctors. We would, I would love to have you all on the program, along with Chris, to discuss renationalizing the NHS, stopping the privatization of the NHS, and merging mental health care into, into the single payer system, as well as a pharmacare and, the antidepressants and whatnot that folks like myself take to be part of, that nationalized program. So then on to the next question I wanted to ask you, which is, can you briefly, if it's possible, update us on the possibility of the finest publisher and political prisoner in Belmarsh prison, the fine humanitarian that is Julian Assange? And do you think, despite the shameful High Court ruling in England refusing to hear his appeal not to be extradited to the US, that there is still a chance he can be set free? What avenues can his legal team and the solidarity movement still do to not only stop the extradition but set him free from Belmarsh?
Well, I mean, we've got to keep trying. I mean, it's looking increasingly bleak, the prospects for Julian. I mean, in reality, there is no legal justification, as I can tell, to hold him in any event. He was sentenced to a year in prison for breaking bail conditions when he sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy, which in itself, I think, is wrong to impose a sentence on an asylum seeker, as he was a political asylum seeker. But
Exactly.
nevertheless, even if you accept that, that sentence was served, about 18 months ago. He was then detained on the basis that he was deemed to be a flight risk. But then if you examine the extradition treaty between the States and the UK, frankly, I can't see how he's being, on what grounds it's seeking to extradite him in any event. And if there was political will, I mean, this would have just been thrown out. And indeed, the judiciary have let us down very badly, in my view, because the extradition treaty very clearly stipulates that if the request is political, then it's null and void. And so, in my opinion, nothing could be more political than exposing war crimes. And yet here we are. I mean, Julian has been incarcerated now in Belmarsh for getting on for 2.5 years. He then add on to that 7 years or so that he was effectively under house arrest in the Ecuadorian embassy. He's not been at liberty for 10 years. It's an absolute travesty of justice, frankly, and a huge attack on free speech and the freedom of the press. And the media, the corporate media, has not covered itself in glory, to say the least. And the likes of the Guardian, in particular, that used Julian Assange to help their circulation, made a lot of money out of him, and they've absolutely not just abandoned him, but some of the appalling hacks. Well, indeed, but it's not just throwing him under the bus. I mean, they've sort of been ridiculing some of these appalling hacks who, aren't fit to tie his bootlaces. Using their platforms to ridicule Julian Assange. It's truly despicable, repulsive sight, to be honest with you. We have to keep pressure. We have to keep hope alive. I believe that his legal team are seeking legal redress in the United States now as well. But it's looking bleak. But all we can do is keep trying and keep going, and don't give up. And I mean, Julian has a lot of support around the world, as we know. He would have a lot more if the corporate media did its job and reported just half of the truth about his situation. But of course, it's either they either fail to report at all, or when they do report, it's a distorted, very often anyway, very kind of distorted viewpoint that they impart to the wider general public.
Yeah, and I also just want to say shame on all of those left-leaning folk and NGOs who also threw Julian Assange under the bus.
Yeah.
Now, when they do defend him, they smear him before defending him, to which I say, if you're not going to say anything good about the poor tortured guy, then just don't say anything at all and let us handle it. And it makes my blood boil. It makes me sick to my stomach how so many left-leaning outlets, organizations, and NGOs threw Julian Assange under the bus. You
see the same scenario with those same sort of so-called left-leaning individuals and organizations who are hysterically calling for essentially a third world war in Ukraine. It's truly astonishing to behold people who claim to have some sort of political understanding have been totally taken in by the NATO propaganda.
Speaking of
and this is why we need people like Julian Assange, to help to expose the reality of the situation. But
actually, and a quick follow-up about the about the Ukraine thing, which so many people have gone completely batshit on it, and the propaganda has been astounding because they've been using the music industry, every single food industry, every single part of entertainment culture to gin us all up for another war, for a third world war, was standing with Ukraine and completely minimizing and overlooking the neo-Nazis that have taken over Ukraine and the Western-backed oligarchs. But has the BBC, Channel 4, or LBC, or Talk Radio, have they at least given space to Peter Hitchens of the Mail on Sunday, who's one of the few journalist with a huge platform on the big, corporate newspaper who's invited on these kind of programs because he doesn't suffer from anti-Russia derangement syndrome or anti-Putin derangement syndrome, and he's actually quite good when it comes to pushing back against that. The Western Gulf War on Syria, as well as Libya and Iraq and so forth. So has even a very far right, socially conservative guy like Peter Hitchens, has he allowed to be given space to push back against the
if he has,
NATO's a force
if he has,
for good?
if he has, I haven't seen him. Although I find it very difficult to watch the corporate news these days because it's so biased, it's so full of misinformation. It's very difficult to sit through it. I ended up, it's no good for my blood pressure. I've got to say, but I've not seen him. I haven't seen him. It has been reported in the Mail, which he's a columnist for anyway. I mean, and then the Daily Mail is a right-wing newspaper in this country, and but he's had he's been able to say his piece there. So he may have had the occasional platform, but that's absolutely overwhelmed by all the other alternative propaganda that is spewed out on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's unbelievable, but we really do need to double our efforts now. Yeah, we just need to double our I think the peace movement just needs to double our efforts. The détente movement that wants no new Cold Wars with China and Russia, we just all need to step up our efforts. And those who are rah, I'm with NATO, I stand with Ukraine, even though they have Nazi symbols and they're lionizing Nazi collaborators, we just need to step up our game. And those on the left who are propping this up, I think we just take our distance from them and we just call them out on their BS, right?
Well, they've lost their minds, some of them. That's the truth of it. And there was a march at the weekend. I don't think there were that many on it. People walking through the street with chanting something on the lines of "Let's end Putin's reign, arm Ukraine." I mean, these people are. I've lost for words to describe them. I mean, it's astonishing, really. I mean, I think the Labour movement should be demanding diplomatic efforts be made to bring peace to the situation in Ukraine. And of course, the war should never have started. It could have been avoided. People like, the irony is that these characters who claim to be on the left are to the right of people like Henry Kissinger on this issue. I mean, he was arguing 8 years ago that if Ukraine was to survive, it would need to be a neutral country in neither camp, a bridge between the two, essentially. And this is Henry Kissinger, and there's other people like John Mearsheimer who was predicting that, if Ukraine continued to be led down the primrose path, it would result in Ukraine being wrecked. I mean, and he made that speech or lecture.
Well, and
2015, 7 years ago, he predicted precisely what's happening.
The gentleman, depending on your point of view, but the columnist and the author I mentioned, Peter Hitchens, I mean, he's very right-wing. I mean, he's socially conservative right-wing. I mean, he says that the Tory party's not right-wing enough. I mean, the guy thinks that everyone is the guy thinks everyone's a Trotskyist and stuff like that. I mean, he's definitely an anti-communist fundamentalist, and yet he's the one that makes the most sense on Ukraine and Putin, whereas like George Monbiot's Paul Mason, that the guy who always sounds like he has a plug up his nose. The VAR media and all these people have all gone completely batshit when it comes to Putin. It's like, what is wrong with you people? John McDonnell is going to marches standing with Ukraine and then laughs it up with Alistair Campbell saying that Tony Blair is not a war criminal. What's going on? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a topsy-turvy world, isn't it? And it's hard to stand out for peace and for the truth, particularly when people who previously were part of a peace movement, seem to be now all in favour of war in Ukraine. I mean, I mean, you know, just in terms of the future of humanity, the future of civilization on the planet. I mean, what essentially they are advocating is potential third world war and a nuclear holocaust. For what? To protect and to defend a country that is influenced by neo-Nazis, who are very significant players in the military there, and have been embraced and actually were in the vanguard of the coup that overthrew the previous democratically elected government in 2014, which is far from perfect, but it was the democratically elected government. Of course, this was all done at the behest of the United States of America, and you've got Victoria Nuland handing out cookies to the the people who were calling for the overthrow of the democratically elected government. I mean, just imagine something like that happening in the United States of America if some Russian diplomats had gone along to the where the Trump supporters invaded the Capitol Hill. If some of Russian diplomats had gone out and urging them on and handing out refreshments. I mean, it's unconscionable.
It's
the double standards, though, of course. I mean, but this is a proxy war that's going on, of course. I mean, and the longer term aim of the neocons, who are in the ascendancy in the administration in the United States, and certainly have huge influence over Europe as well, is to balkanize Russia. Essentially, this is a proxy war against Russia, and so to enable them to pivot towards China. And not only are they engaged in supporting this military resistance, which ultimately will, unless it ends in a nuclear holocaust, the inevitable outcome is Ukraine will lose, and Ukraine will have to be a neutral country. It's not just the military operation which they're involved with, it's these sanctions, these economic sanctions, which are rebounding against the European populations. I mean, food bills and fuel bills are going through the roof. We're looking at potential shortages. I mean, and Germany in particular is vulnerable, because I think 40% of their energy requirements comes currently from Russia. I mean, the efforts that were made to try and trash the Russian currency, the ruble, has totally backfired. The ruble is rallied and is now at last time I looked, at a higher level than it was in the pre-war period earlier this year. In fact, the latest round of sanctions that were imposed, the immediate result of that saw the ruble rallying still further and the Russian stock markets rising. So it's simply not working. And when you think that, Russia, all the raw materials, the fertilizers, the food, the energy that comes from Russia, this is just makes no sense at all. But the neocons, I mean, they're kind of, the elites, the political class, they're insulated from this. I mean, the likes of Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, said that the British people are prepared to make economic sacrifices in defence of democracy. Well, I mean, it's questionable that Ukraine is a legitimate democracy in any event. But even if
England's not even democracy. England's not even a liberal democracy. England's a plutocracy. It's a Keynesian plutocracy.
But in terms of the sacrifice, it's not him that's going to be making the sacrifices. People are already struggling to pay their energy bills, to put food on the table. We have a massive problem in the UK of fuel poverty, people struggling to heat their homes adequately. Every single year in Britain, there are what's referred to as excess winter deaths, and a large proportion of those are down to ill health brought about as a result of living in cold homes. And that's only going to get worse. And people's fuel bills, I mean, my energy bill has increased by around £1,000 per annum. We can afford to pay it. Luckily, we're in a fortunate position. I mean, we're not rich, but we have the ability to absorb that. But for people who are on a low wage or on social security benefits or on a fixed basic pension, they are simply not going to be able to pay. I mean, what are people supposed to do in those circumstances? I mean, it's a truly shocking state of affairs. So I hope that the privations which are being visited on people will result in a political backlash against the so-called centrist establishment because they're absolutely not serving the interests of the British public, or indeed of the American public, or indeed of the European public.
And
The
folks,
question is, though, which way will people jump, though? I mean, we've seen in the French presidential elections first round that Marine Le Pen has, I think,
she's done it
equaled
again.
the.
She's
Yeah,
done
yeah.
it again.
So the choice will be, between her and Macron, and there's a real chance that she might get it, because I mean, obviously, I preferred clearly, Mélenchon to come through. It's a tragedy that he didn't make. I think he got 19%, if I'm correct in what I've seen. But from what I hear, many of Macron's supporters will either abstain in the second round or even vote for Marine Le Pen, because people are so fed up of the status quo. Now, that's quite a frightening thought, but is it any more frightening than the continuation of a character like Macron, this kind of Blairite figure who wants to rip up the social contract in France, that obviously the French are more rebellious than the Brits have been, and we've accepted it here. The reforms that initially, well, it was Thatcher that kind of accelerated them, but the truth was it was Jim Callaghan and Dennis Healey, who were the Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer respectively, who started this process in 1976.
Exactly. New Labour before the Blair Witch.
Well, this is pre-New Labour. This is pre-New Labour. This is in 1976 when Dennis Healey went to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout on a false premise that Britain was running out of money, which is impossible when you issue your own currency. But he went for this bailout, never actually drew it down in the end. Healey admitted that he was given false information by his officials, and they still nevertheless implemented the conditions that were imposed by the IMF, which was huge austerity. In fact, the first neoliberal, the first monetarist government in Britain was not Thatcher, it was Jim Callaghan and Dennis Healey. They're the ones that started it, and then obviously Thatcher came in and accelerated that process, and Blair came in and just continued it on still further, further deregulation, etc. I mean, and Thatcher herself said in 2002 that her greatest achievement was New Labour, Tony Blair and New Labour.
And and then the torture never stops, because after the Blair Witch Project and that right-wing dingbat Gordon Brown, he then had David Cameron and liberal Democrats, which made a lot of liberal Democrats folk very angry, accelerating endless austerity, as well as the privatization of the NHS, and jacking up the prices of higher education. Then comes Theresa May, and then of course the civil war that was Brexit, and unfortunately the Corbyn project was demolished, which we've talked about many times on the program, you and I, and even and even when we both were afraid, I think the Tories are going to win if they're going to continue on with this stupid Remain fundamentalism, but all water under the bridge. But then is it safe to say, before I get to my very last question, but then is it safe to say then that under Mr. Boris Johnson, he's not been the one nation Tory, the compassionate conservative that he said he was going to be?
Well, look, I mean, compassionate conservatism is an oxymoron anyway. But I mean, if you look at the program that the Tory government has pursued, I mean, much of it's not that dissimilar to what the likes of Ed Miliband were arguing for in 2015.
So he is a one nation Tory then. So he is a compassionate.
Well, I wouldn't. Well, as I say, it is an oxymoron, because at the end of the day, they serve the interests of the elites. We do have well over 10 million, around 14 million people in poverty. Still, the situation is going to get far worse. We saw how in the COVID crisis, how it was the interests of the oligarchs, the elites, the corporate capitalists that benefited from the government's policy agenda, its policy response, and there was utterly inadequate support for ordinary people in this country. So no, I mean, they're very clear, I think, where their priorities lie. But there's not that much difference now between Tory and the Labour Party and with the Liberal Democrats. I mean, they're all neoliberals at the end of the day. They're all imperialist, and in some ways, the Labour Party under well, of course, I mean, well, that goes without saying. But I mean, they're more sort of a hawkish warmongering under Sir Keir Starmer than the Tories are potentially. So. We to go back to where we started, we're so badly served in this country by our political class. There is no real democracy in that sense. There is no real choice available to people. We are very much in a similar situation, I think, to ordinary people in the United States of America, where you've got the Republicans and the Democrats, and there's very little to choose between them. And indeed, many of the Republicans are less bellicose, ironically, less warmongering than the Democrats are, and we're getting to that sort of situation here in the UK as well. So there definitely needs to be a reset, and maybe the crisis which is enveloping people, ordinary working class communities in this country, maybe that will, the response to that, maybe that will result in a fight back, in an alternative emerging. But as I was saying previously, we need to be careful what that alternative is.
Well, that's what you're trying to do. That's what you're trying to do.
That's yes, it is. Yeah.
Equality Party.
But it's so difficult to. But Youri, it's so difficult to cut through. I mean, we shouldn't minimise the scale of the challenge. I mean, it was a big enough challenge when we were trying to achieve something through the auspices of the Labour Party, through Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. When you're outside of that, when you have no parliamentary representation, when you're faced with a first past the post electoral system, when you're faced with an establishment which will do everything in its power to ensure that you don't make much headway, and if you do start to make headway, there will be efforts to divide and demonize and of course, smear you. You've got the group, you've got the corporate media, which again is totally biased against you. So the challenges are enormous. We shouldn't minimize those, but we've got to try, and we have to be inspired, I think, by the pioneers of the labour movement in this country and around the world. We have to be inspired by liberation struggles that have and are still taking place in countries around the world, in Latin America and Africa and in Asia and so on. And try and build links with those groups. But we're taking on very, very powerful vested interests who will do everything they can to maintain their privileged position.
Then I'd like you to respond then to this briefly, if it's possible, which is the whole identity politics versus the class struggle debate, which I think is a toxic subject, which I don't even think should be an issue. I think as leftists, we should be able to chew gum and walk at the same time. We should be socially liberal as well as, economically, left, and we should be able to fight, institutional racism, the patriarchy, heteronormativity, as well as classism all in one go. So that said, where do you stand on the whole identity politics versus the class struggle debate? How would you approach that so that you're not throwing trans people, women, Black Lives Matter under the bus? The reason why I asked that is because, and I know I'm probably going to get in trouble by a comrade of yours, but I know, Mr. George Galloway was talking about how he's more blue labor than he is a Trotskyist. And I know that there's a lot of Trotskyists that weaponize identity politics and are imperialists, but not all. But he was talking about blue labor, and blue labor, that's very narrow-minded left, nationalism and people who think that the European Union colonized the UK, which I don't think is true. England's the one that colonizes everyone else. But you have those blue labor folk like, Paul Amberby, and, these are the kind of people who write for, right-wing populist outlets like Spiked Online. And those are not my, comrades. Those are not my comrades. The people who denigrated Black Lives Matter when they were protesting in Britain against institutional racism that exists in Britain. So how do you go about the whole identity politics versus the class struggle debate? Because when Galloway, Paul Emberby, and folks like that say that they're tired of hearing about identity politics, for me, it sounds as if that's code for I don't want to talk about white supremacy. I don't want to talk about heteronormativity and queer phobia. And I don't want to talk about, patriarchy.
Well, I mean, I think George would probably describe himself as socially conservative on some issues, but he's a great class warrior, a fantastic anti-imperialist campaigner. And I think if we are serious about building an alternative to the neoliberal status quo, then we have to build a coalition. And that will mean working alongside people who you don't necessarily agree with on every single issue. And identity politics has been used to divide us rather than bring us together. And I think that the overarching battle, frankly, is the class struggle, is the class wars. As John McClane said in the First World War when he was railing against that bloody war, that the only war that's worth fighting is the class war. And he's absolutely right. And of course, the class war has been relegated and, to, well, an attempt to sort of relegate it to sort of irrelevance. And you've kind of got the absurd spectacle now of even Boris Johnson claiming to have the most diverse cabinet in history. Well, if you judge it by the number of women, a number of black and brown faces in it, well, maybe, yeah, but who are they representing in society? Which kind of cohort are they in reality coming from, being drawn from in society? I mean, they're not being drawn from, a wide spectrum. They're being drawn from a very narrow part of the population. They're very wealthy, elite part of the population. So I think that's important, in terms of.
But at the same time, though, even though you can have your great gains in workers' rights and pushing back against institutional classism, but you had many of those I'm not going to be around the bush, white working class folk who still discriminated against Black people, against LGBTQ plus people, against women. I mean, you still have women
well, nobody would advocate that
work, and
I don't think anybody would be advocating that. I mean, there's certainly it would be a caricature and a completely inaccurate portrayal of somebody like George Galloway, for example, to suggest that that's what he is doing. I mean, George would die in a ditch, I think,
but the blue Labour folk?
Well, I can't really comment about the Blue Labour folk. I mean, I don't know that much about them, to be honest with you. I'm not, kind of a Blue Labour sounds kind of an odd sort of, again, another oxymoron, it seems to me, in any event, really. But I think just to come back to the point, though, if we're serious about building a coalition, then we are going to have to work with people who we don't agree with on everything, and let's have comradely differences of opinion and comradely discussions. And while ever we are divided, while ever we, focus on identity politics to the exclusion of class politics, and while ever we allow that to prevent us from collaborating, well, that's great as far as the elites in society are concerned, because that status quo will prevail by doing that. The only way in which we are going to make headway and make progress is if we could find common cause with people that we don't agree with on every issue. But let's find a way of collaborating and working together to build a strong movement. If we don't do that, then we are never going to cut through. We're never going to make any difference at all. We'll just be again talking to ourselves. No point in talking to ourselves. We need to be talking to the mass of people. And we have to also recognize, where a lot of people are at. I mean, not unsurprisingly, with the kind of daily diet of propaganda and bullshit that they're fed from the corporate media. But the way forward, it seems to me, as socialists, is about trying to raise political consciousness. And you do that through comradely discussion, not by sort of saying, well, I'm more pure on trans rights, or, I'm more pure on Black Lives Matter issues than these characters are over here. Obviously, these are really important issues. But let's try and focus where, as I say, we are in agreement. We know that society is completely unequal and unfair and is kind of rigged against the interests of ordinary working class people. I think that should be the starting point. So let's start from there and try and build, movements around that, and then use that to, have these kind of discussions about some of these other issues, because they are obviously crucially important. And as I say, you'd not find any stronger advocate, I don't think, than people like George Galloway, who would absolutely argue very strongly, against racism. Look, let's remember, George was working undercover for the African National Congress, putting his life at risk, So, I mean, George gets a bad rap, completely unfairly, in my view. I don't agree with obviously every position that George takes up, obviously not. I mean, you're never going to agree 100-0 with anybody, I don't think. I'm probably more socially liberal well, I am more socially liberal, I think, than George, but
All right.
he is a great advocate, I think, for socialism. Probably one of the best orators anywhere in the world, and I think you want people like that on your side. We shouldn't be alienating people like George Galloway. We should be working and collaborating with them if we're serious about trying to build an alternative. If all we're thinking about is you just sort of burnishing your own kind of moral superiority, then fine. But you're not really kind of you're not really going to change anything like that. But if that's what floats your boat, then fine. But if you're serious about trying to, mount a challenge to the orthodoxy, mount a challenge to the status quo, well, then you're going to have to hold your nose a little bit and work with people you don't necessarily agree with.
But I would just say, though, in defense of my my identity leftists, my black leftists, my queer leftists, and feminist leftists, and so forth. I think in their defense, they would say, well, we've had so many gains for the white working class, the white cisgender working class, and so forth, and yet they're still discriminated against us. They still don't show up for when we're being brutalized by the police, when there's sexual harassment going on in the workplace, and when our queer brothers and sisters are being murdered left, right, and center, and being mocked.
Well, nobody's saying that that's acceptable. But nobody's saying that that's. I mean, I'm certainly not saying that's acceptable. Well, anybody like. I mean, we keep talking about George or whatever, but I've not heard anybody saying, well, it's fine to discriminate against black people. It's fine, to discriminate against gay and trans people. No, I don't think anybody's saying that.
Okay.
I think that's a caricature of what people are saying. But people have, look, there are many feminists, for example, who are dismissed and are cancelled because they have some anxieties about
because they're transphobic.
Okay, but people, I don't think by just cutting them out, cancelling, dismissing them, and saying, well, you're not part of our movement, we're not going to work with you, that suits the ruling elites, because the progressive left, if you like, for want of a better way of describing it, are falling out amongst themselves. Why can't we have comradely disagreements? Okay, well, I disagree with you on that, but actually, in terms of the class struggle, the inequalities in society, we can agree on that. And let's kind of focus on trying to tear down some of that stuff, whilst at the same time having some of these discussions, not to dismiss them. I certainly am on side of those kind of.
But J.K. Rowling's no leftist. She was a Blairite.
No, I know, absolutely. Of course she is. Yeah, indeed, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've no time for her whatsoever. I don't think she would necessarily want to work with me, and she spent a lot of her time kind of demonizing me in any event. However, I mean, we're not talking about the likes of J.K. Rowling. I'm just talking about the mass of people out there.
Well, I would just say, for those on the left who may have racist blind spots, queerphobic blind spots, or sexist blind spots, solidarity goes both ways. If you want my people, black people, indigenous people, Latinx people, to come to your marches because Amazon is union busting you, or is about to ship your job over to Indonesia, where the workers there are going to be paid less than $1, then, well, come to our rallies to fight against police brutality and
I don't think anybody's arguing against. I don't think anybody's arguing against that, Youri. I mean, you kind of go back into the minus.
Some are, though.
Well, maybe, but I mean, I think we've ended up in it's sort of ever decreasing circles of this kind of irrelevant discussion about the purity or otherwise of particular people and their views on particular topics. As I say, you can disagree with people. Go back to the miners' strike and how the gay community got behind the miners' strike. I mean, and there was a lot of bigotry, homophobic attitudes in those working class. But by the end of the miners' strike, you've got miners' lodges going on, gay pride marches. I mean, there's a very moving film called Pride, actually.
Yeah, beautiful movie. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I mean, so look, I mean, but that was done through dialogue. I mean, they had common cause. They fought on an issue on which they agreed. There were some disagreements, but there was a raising of consciousness. That's the way to do it, in my view. Not just sort of say, well, this is my view, and you're just a bunch of bigots, and I'm not going to have anything to do with you. You're just serving the interests of the ruling elites by taking that attitude. And I think we, as I say, focus, because there's far more that we agree on. Let's focus on where we agree and have comradely discussions about those areas where we disagree, and hopefully raise political consciousness through that sort of shared political perspective on most issues.
Interesting. This conversation is to be continued, but I just will say one thing. If you're a bigoted leftist, you're also digging your own grave. But now we get to our now, Chris, before I let you enjoy the rest of your afternoon, because you also have a big interview to plan for tonight with two-time past guest Jackie Walker and some of our comrades that we spend time with at the Labour Party conference. So Chris, just before I let you go, we end, the show nowadays with the questionnaire done by Marcel Proust, later French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, and then my hero, the late James Lipton, host of Inside the Actors Studio. Chris, this is your turn to do this, so here it goes. Chris Williamson, what is your favorite word?
Favorite word? Oh, I don't know.
Yeah.
Socialism.
What's your least favorite word?
Bigotry, probably.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Youri.
Like what really inspires you, puts like a great smile on your face and go, wow, life is beautiful. Is it is it your partner? Is it children laughing? Is it like a good piece of music?
Well, I think it's the well, yeah, it's kind of all of those things really. But I suppose the beautiful Derbyshire countryside on a nice blue-skied summer's day.
I can't wait to visit you in Derby so that you can show me that. Hopefully the weather is good. Then what what turns you off then?
I suppose the diet of propaganda that we're fed, the manufacturing of consent that we see the broadcast media engaged in, and not just on the news broadcast, but also in dramas and so on, which I think is very regrettable.
Yeah, and what's your favorite curse words?
Fuck, I suppose.
Alrighty, and what sound or noise do you love?
I think the sound of a babbling brook.
And what sound or noise do you hate?
These souped up cars with very noisy exhausts. That really does my head in.
Yeah, and if you weren't doing what you're doing right now, which is which is brilliant journalism and activism, and and the resist movement, what profession would you love to do?
Well, I'm sort of semi-retired now. I suppose I don't know, maybe gardening.
A politician
like
again, be the MP for Derby North again.
Well, I mean, there's that. But I mean, if I was looking at that's kind of linked, I suppose, to the sort of thing I'm doing now, really, in a way. But yeah, I guess it would be something to do with getting my hands dirty in the garden, landscape gardening, maybe.
And what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
A butcher, I suppose, as a vegan, that would just be completely anathema.
And that's another subject I want to talk to you about in the future: animal rights. And shout out to my friend Trish, who is a strong vegan advocate. Then the final question, Chris, is if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is the afterlife that you believe in or don't believe in? Well,
welcome, Chris. You've lived a good life.
Well, Chris, You're always welcome on 1+1. I'm going to let you go. It's been we were joined on this edition of 1+1, our all things England's UK edition with my good friend Chris Williamson. Chris, it's been too long. Let's try not to let's try not to leave it too long again. You're welcome back on the program anytime. In fact, we're even planning another interview soon. And all my best to your Team at Resistance movement. And folks, tonight Chris is going to be on a program with past guest Jackie Walker. I'll give the link to the YouTube and the Twitter if people want to register on Zoom and watch it. But until then, Chris, thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to speaking to you in a month from now, okay?
Nice one. Thanks, mate. Best of luck.
Ciao until then.